Says here, new Superman trailer hopes to inspire audiences to look up once more. You'll believe DC Studios can fly if co-CEO James Gunn has anything to say about it. Writer-director Gunn's first new Superman trailer takes flight Thursday morning with hopes of inspiring audiences to once more look up to DC's iconic superhero. Interest is rising among fans, Hollywood, and entertainment press, if not yet among the public at large, in Gunn's rebooted Superman, but will it be enough? While I have every confidence in Gunn's filmmaking abilities and his eye for what makes these characters popular and click with a broad mainstream audience, I don't have equal confidence in audiences' appetite for more DC movies after only 2 years since the final DC film in a decade-long failed DCEU. Interesting point. There are advantages and disadvantages on the road to DC's box office redemption, each with potential to have its own impact on Superman's box office future and thus the future of DC Studios. It says here, DCEU Superman barely got off the ground. When it started, the Man of Steel movie was meant to launch a new Superman franchise capable of maintaining DC's box office position in the aftermath of Christopher Nolan's massively successful The Dark Knight franchise. Having lifted Batman to $1 billion box office, Nolan and fellow Dark Knight franchise alum David Goyer set their sights on making Man of Steel, a similarly grounded in Fox reality approach to DC superheroes, with hopes of delivering equally blockbuster results. Crucially, however, Nolan envisioned this as a standalone series that wouldn't really share a world with a cast of other superheroes. Production wasn't even finished, however, when the executive at Warner Brothers changed their mind and decided they couldn't pass up the type of money Marvel Studios was minting with 2012's $1.5 billion hit The Avengers. Plans shifted quickly towards using Man of Steel to launch a DC shared cinematic universe, probably contributing to Nolan's fast-fading interest in continuing as the grandfather over the series. After Man of Steel, $670 million box office run in 2013, which is $970 million in inflation-adjusted dollars, but still a couple of $100 million below studio expectations. Warner, who'd presumed they would have to, or they could skip ahead of laying a foundation straight to $1 billion by writing Nolan's The Dark Knight trilogy name-dropping, accelerated plans to produce a Justice League film and get Batman into the mix, while Superman lost the status of the focus of the studio plans and attention. Man of Steel was followed by Batman v Superman, with Superman getting second billing in the title and being killed off at the end of the story, in which the world turns against him and Batman kicks his butt. Just as he's arrived in our midst, the controversial Henry Cavill Superman was gone. I specifically remember this moment in fandom because there were reports of Man of Steel 2 and the plans for that. And then all of a sudden you start hearing like, oh, Batman's going to be involved. Oh, all of a sudden it's Batman v Superman. So like this was just Warner Brothers scrambling. They looked at what happened with Avengers and they were like, yeah, sure, the Dark Knight trilogy was successful, but it took about 10 years for that whole trilogy because there was a 3-year break, a 3-year break, and a 4-year break. And even if they all made $1 billion, that's just not what Marvel's doing. Marvel all of a sudden looked like it was going to be taking off like crazy, way more money. And so I remember specifically when this happened, right? And when they changed that, right? But the story around was much deeper, more complicated, and longer than studio leadership wanted to release. So filmmaker Zack Snyder, who'd taken over as visionary leader of the DCEU, was forced to gut much of the film's central motivations for Batman and Superman's animosity towards one another, and removing most of Superman's emotional and heroic arcs in the process. This is the big difference between the theatrical run of BVS and the director's cut. The director's cut is much, much better. The theatrical cut of Batman v Superman suffered as a result, and its $874 million blockbuster box office was still much lower than the studio hoped and expected, and lower than the bottom level outcome, about $900 million or a bit higher, they would have accepted to allow Snyder's plans to proceed mostly unmolested. So, having jettisoned plans for a solo Superman series, they were now jettisoning another creative vision built around Superman based once more on execs know best thinking. Superman, already pushed aside in the follow-up to his franchise launch, was further ostracized by his studio, convinced nobody wanted more Superman. Do you remember this? Do you remember the years of rumors that we were going to get cameos of Superman? Remember Henry Cavill had that weird video where he had the Superman toy basically saying that he was still Superman? They put a cameo of Man of Steel's suit and the Superman in the end of Shazam, but no Henry Cavill. These all happened. I remember it all. Warner Brothers was being goobly glob, right? I won't rehash the whole dirty affair again, as I've covered it in such detail across so many articles over the years. You can find the whole body of reports easier with a search engine than me trying to dive into it all again. Suffice it to say, Snyder's and screenwriters Chris Terrio's epic and ambitious vision for Superman, Batman, and the Justice League built around Superman wound up stuck between competing priorities and studio demands. Not to mention conflicting preferences and plans among the creative leadership overseeing the project. If you are a Snyder fan and you understood what happened, you know what that was. The heartbreaking loss of Zack and Deborah Snyder's daughter, Autumn, in 2015 resulted in the reworking of Justice League by Joss Whedon that turned the project into a Batman-centric story, and the film's 2017 $661 million box office disappointment resulted in yet another rethinking and further studio meddling to try to save the DCU at the same leadership that already failed at fixing it last time. This is when they bring in James Wan, and James Wan was supposed to be running everything. I remember all of this stuff, man. We covered all this stuff. Whatever else can be said, Cavill's Superman felt grounded by Warner Brothers and was never fully brought on board after Man of Steel. This hurt the DCEU's chances of endearing Superman to audiences. I agree. But it also makes it easier for audiences to move past the DCEU's Superman, since his only screen appearance in the past 7 years was a 2022 post-credit cameo in the little scene Black Adam. I totally disagree with this point because the Snyder cut itself was epic. Cavill was incredible in that. And then getting Cavill back in Black Adam was legitimately very smart of The Rock. And if you look at the gross of Black Adam compared to like all the other DCEU stuff that came out after it, brother, it was actually fairly successful by comparison. Okay? But let's just keep on moving on. Superman suffers as Sony sinks. Meanwhile, Sony was doing its part to simultaneously turn Spider-Man into a near $2 billion live-action juggernaut and a $1 billion animated franchise, earning Oscar nominations while also savaging the reputation and quality efforts of the genre with its struggling and mercifully shelved Sony's Spider-Man universe. Kraven the Hunter, abominable $26 million global debut last week, where a mere $11 million domestic provided a less than memorable end to the SSU, as Sony was already promising to stay focused on the primary Spider-Man solo films in live action and animation from now on. At least for now. We'll see how long that lasts. I agree. So, I've argued before, while the DCEU did the vast majority of the damage to DC's reputation and brand, I suspect Sony's consistent release of these SSU also ran films in their restrained failure to deliver on their premises contributed to audiences growing weary of comic book films overall and hurt the genre's reputation overall. Holy cow. I literally made this point yesterday. You can go watch the clip on the Clips channel. You can watch the whole show from yesterday. I made this point yesterday because there are rumors that Sony's considering selling this shit back to Marvel, the Spider-Man license. And I said maybe the only real reason that Marvel would want to buy it is so that Sony stops ruining comic book movies. They are adding to the fatigue, man. So Sony and Kraven catch some strays in this article. That this coincided so much with the COVID pandemic, particularly the DCEU losing its opportunity to regain some theatrical box office prestige after Aquaman's post-Justice League billion-dollar performance, suggested audiences hadn't quite fully given up on the DC shared universe yet. Alas, the opportunity was not squandered, but was significantly hamstrung by the fact that Wonder Woman 1984, The Suicide Squad, and even potentially Zack Snyder's Justice League, which could have easily been split into two parts and released on Memorial Day and Christmas, weren't able to get normal full theatrical releases that could have otherwise been hits based off the franchise popularity, great marketing, and being actually great films. Fair. And that meant any hope of the DCEU Superman getting any love was lost. Despite the potential and opportunities to restore Man of Steel's public image, still, at least Cavill's Superman got to appear in a completed DC universe and had his own limited and fulfilled in general, with 5 film appearances if we count the 2 versions of Justice League separately. Interesting. The fact is, Marvel and its parent studio Disney are the only studios so far that seem to have learned the COVID-era lessons significantly and understand how to apply them, earning box office again with only relatively minor stumbles that never caused them to fall as badly as long as others. Another point that I have continuously made, Marvel did stumble, obviously, but they did not fall as far, and they have adjusted better than any other studio out there. Marvel actually still puts up moderate blockbuster numbers in 2020 and 2021, while most franchises and studios were non-starting or doing awful numbers. And by 2022, Marvel was back to general blockbuster levels again, then had its worst COVID-era year, post-COVID-era year in 2023 with the underperformance of Ant-Man and the Quantum Wasp, huge success of Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3, and then the Marvels became the biggest flop of the MCU. It's actually the biggest flop in the history of Hollywood. But we must recognize the reality of the context of the 2021 to 2023 period, where the box office was littered with franchises and tentpoles and expensive would-be blockbusters crashing and burning in a theatrical industry free fall, except Marvel, which weathered the storm best and really only had a few bumps in the road compared to most everyone else's 3-year crisis, which is going on 4-year crisis, to be clear. Audiences didn't get sick of superhero movies. They got sick of the non-MCU superhero movies. So DC's woes can't be left on the doorstep of superhero fatigue. The public at large was no longer interested in showing up for DC superhero films, even when Batman is in them, and even if it's a Joker sequel. 2022's The Batman was the last time audiences trusted DC enough to show up. Superman's new boss, same as the old boss, the failure in the end of the DCEU represented studios' leadership's lack of understanding in their own character and brands, as well as a lack of understanding of or serious consideration of what the audiences wanted or why they wanted it. Once Warner stopped really understanding what did or didn't make their films popular or why, it was impossible for them to fix it. So they couldn't properly support projects that needed and deserved help and attention most, nor cut loose projects and execs who were a part of the problem in the first place. Now, while Warner Brothers Discovery has new leadership post-merger, who've made plenty of controversial and questionable decisions, which I've been openly critical of here and elsewhere, one choice I agreed with and feel was an important step towards really fixing the studio's DC problems was putting James Gunn and Peter Safran in charge of making DC Studios an independent studio. But they will face widespread audience distrust of the DC brand on film. If Warner needed proof, the Flash's implications for the Batman brand weren't an exception proving the rule. This October's disastrous 206 global gross for eagerly awaited Joker foiled due sequels 2019 $1 billion Oscar-winning Joker. Whatever excuse the other qualifiers we can offer, the bottom line is once again a big budget, big brand DC movie rejected by audiences, even on opening weekend. When nobody showed up for Joker sequel at this level, the studio had an emergency on their hands. Thank goodness the Penguin kept popularity of Matt Reeves' standalone The Batman universe on track and helped boost enthusiasm for The Batman Part 2 in 2026. But that's 2 years away. And it says something that there's probably currently more public awareness and expressed interest in the Reeves sequel than next summer's Superman tentpole. I agree with that. And I think it's pretty wild. There's also the question of whether Warner Bros. Discovery will honor the promise to let DC Studios proceed without interference, a promise already undermined by the fact casting for Superman had to be approved through a committee of executives, including Warner President and CEO David Zaslav. If the studio couldn't resist meddling and driving Nolan away from the DC properties, and after a decade of watching the DCEU decline, it's hard to have faith Gunn and Safran will retain creative control and planning under the latest revolving door leadership if Superman doesn't hit the desired results. Another factor is Creature Commandos, a good new animated series that launches the DCEU with first official property on Max, formerly and better named HBO Max. The show has particularly good action editing and animation. It appeals to fans like me who love this stuff in general, who love Gunn's storytelling, and who appreciate animation for any kind of story and audience. The problem is, so far, there aren't many signs Creature Commandos is getting a sort of larger viewership it needs in order to send a clear signal that the DCU is off to a strong start. I've mentioned this before, but you guys just said I was a hater, so maybe you'll listen to the Forbes article guy. Part of that could be the adult R-rated content, which I'd argue is a questionable choice for the very first project to kick off a brand new DCU. And I'm going to get on my soapbox again to say adult fans need to get over the obsession with wanting R-rated superheroes all of the time. Comics manage to tell these stories the vast majority of the time without needing R-rated levels of profanity, gore, nudity, and other things treated as grown-up when it's more akin to the preference and behaviors of teenage fans who merely falsely associate such things and behaviors with acting grown up. I don't need my comic book adaptations to overcompensate. I'm not embarrassed or ashamed of liking comic book material, nor do I feel it needs an R rating to sell serious stories enjoyable by all ages of fans. Yet, sometimes R-rated stories happen in comics, and sometimes that's the best approach. But there's a growing drumbeat from fans and execs for more adult-oriented superhero content. And I feel it's gotten way out of hand to the point it's becoming repetitive and derivative. Again, this stuff can be good or great, but it still also becomes exclusionary of other fans the more it leans into those things. Creature Commandos could have easily been PG-13 and not missed a beat. Because if you're launching a new DCU and trying to get everyone on board, I think getting fans of all ages matters on the front end. Because what I fear happening is mainstream viewers who rarely pay much attention to this stuff the way fans and press do are getting to see these efforts towards the more edgy R-rated DC superheroes and think it's more of the same thing we saw from the DCEU. Crazy, because this was actually legitimately something many people brought up. Now, granted, a lot of Snyder fans brought this up specifically because many people that don't like Snyder and didn't think he was good for DC, one of the reasons they believe that is because they thought Zack's hard R approach, or I guess just more gritty, dark, and grounded approach, was not actually what DC needed. DC needed to be more full of heart and not actually that crazy level of violence. And a lot of people brought this shit up, man. A lot of people brought this shit up. They were like, look at this stuff in Creature Commandos. It feels exactly like Snyder, right? So again, this author here is bringing this up, and I think it's totally fair. And it doesn't help so much of the DCEU's final few years featured several characters of lower audience awareness or baked-in interest to launch a franchise, right when the DCEU was on a downward trajectory already. So a Creature Commandos show doesn't do much to change that impression. However, good it is, and whatever other qualifiers I can keep adding to make my point without being rejected out of hand for not appreciating it, regardless of whether it works from a business sense or not. Which brings us back to The Penguin, which dominated streaming viewership for 2 months and ramped up interest in The Batman Part 2. I don't know if I would say dominated, maybe from the perspective of just Max, which like nobody watches, sure, but it didn't dominate shit. Warner and DC Studios would be insane to do anything to harm or stifle Matt Reeves' plans and projects, since at the moment, these are the only DC films and shows doing the sort of business and getting the sort of rave reviews and audience scores the studio desperately needs for the rest of their superhero projects. That is a fair point. With a blockbuster Batman franchise out there doing exactly what made Batman a billion-dollar cash cow in the first place, and with proven success plans for spin-offs to build a larger world of characters in films and series, it begs the question whether the DCU's own plans and shared universe can live up to the reputation and revenue of Reeves' so-called the Batman epic crime saga. It certainly makes me wonder how the DCU version of Batman will fare by comparison. Launching the DCU with an animated R-rated streaming series that feels similar to what we've already seen from DC animation films for years so soon after the DCEU's failed ending is a surprising move. It's a bad move because Gunn is bad at this. So, is kicking off the new plans with a plan that once again starts with a Superman movie, positioning a world full of heroes who are too violent, who kill, a world that distrusts Superman and even apparently arrests him at one point, while Superman wants to inspire the world and other heroes to be better and work together and inspire people? That sure sounds an awful lot like exactly how the DCEU started in the first place, including the attempt to jump ahead to its pre-existing universe without doing the setup. Again, moreover, this Superman also feels a lot like a tonal reset for what could have otherwise been a sequel to Man of Steel. Need I also mention the resemblance between David Corenswet and Henry Cavill? I love this shit. They're finally calling Gunn out. All it took was years and then finally seeing the trailer to actually call him out on all the shit that I've been calling him out for years. Let's keep reading. This is the best article I've ever read. Need I also mention the resemblance between David Corenswet and Henry Cavill? Will this give audiences the impression it is more of the same DCEU? And can trailers and interviews saying, "It's new, trust us," convince audiences? Adding to the problem of convincing viewers to trust and turn out its competition next summer, Superman opens July 11th. Just over a week after Jurassic World Rebirth and 1 week before the Smurfs movie. Then 2 weeks later, major competition from Fantastic Four First Steps on July 25th. There are also several notable releases earlier and after Superman bows that will also vie for some of the target demographics, adding to the challenge. The icing on the "I'm not sure how this will pan out" cake is the fact that Gunn's made it clear that the new DCU will actually make use of some of the past projects from the DCEU to varying extents. His own The Suicide Squad film and Peacemaker series, for example, are being treated essentially carryover backstory that will ignore certain direct ties to the DCEU, but otherwise will include some casting and backstory continuation from the DCEU. It feels like a big risk to take when you also need viewers to perceive your projects as fresh start, unburdened by the previous decade of increasingly unpopular films and plans. Superman's future, the bottom line. None of this is to comment on the qualitative value of the DCU and what Gunn's doing so far. My personal preference and impressions are that I'm going to like this DCU a lot, and it has potential to perform at Marvel levels. But the potential to do so is different from the odds of doing so. And that's going to be determined by average folks around the world who aren't plugged into the nuances and details of the past and present studio planning and continuity. It'll be people walking up to the ticket desk at a multiplex asking, "What should we see tonight?" And it's up to DC Studios to give those audiences a reason to believe and trust in their movies one more time. Superman hasn't been box office bulletproof in a long time. We'll soon find out whether Gunn and the new DCU can provide the sunshine necessary to revive him to his glory once more. It's so refreshing to see journalists actually just spit straight facts. Everything that was in that article are literally points that I have been bringing up over the past year and a half. And Gunn, even though he is a talented filmmaker, I don't know that he really understands the landscape, and I don't know that he actually has the business sense to run this studio. I think he's made a lot of mistakes already. Can the quality of Superman overcome these mistakes? It is possible. But as the Forbes article points out, the odds are stacked against him. And frankly, Gunn is not that guy. So they need to hopefully bring in other people to try to correct some of these mistakes, because I think what they've brought up is totally fair and true. And from a normie perspective, I just don't know that you're going to win a bunch of people back to the DCU. And I also just got to say too, like, obviously, like, I have my own, situation with Gunn. A lot of people have their situation with Gunn. But frankly, he did not do himself any favors by trying to get antagonistic with fans, journalists, and scoopers. That's what you call a really stupid idea.